This is the Comics Alternative Webcomics, a discussion of the best webcomic nominees for the 2018 Eisner Awards. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Webcomics. I'm Derek.
And I'm Sean, and you're listening to two guys with advanced degrees talking about webcomics.
That's right. And for our May show, Sean and I are going to be looking at the 5 nominees for the best webcomic category of this year's Eisner Award nominations. But before we get into that discussion, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Webcomics is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover. But every now and again, you can find discounts that are more impressive than that.
And we'd be remiss if we didn't also mention their sister company, mydigitalcomics.com, for all of your digital comics needs. This is a webcomics podcast. You probably have already an interest in reading comics electronically and not just the dead paper versions. Take a look at mydigitalcomics.com as well. They've got a lot of the big publishers from Image, Action Lab, Asylum, Boom, Dynamite. Take your pick. Plenty of good publishers there. And everything, or very nearly everything they have there, is in PDF and CBZ format, which means that they are DRM free, and it's a big bonus. If you've spent any time working in digital comics, you know that very well. So take a look at mydigitalcomics.com as well if you're looking at your comics electronically.
That's right. And whether you like your comics in digital form or, as Sean put it, in dead paper form, you really can't go wrong with the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com and mydigitalcomics.com. They will take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Sean and Derek sent you. Well, Sean, listeners of our monthly webcomic series probably wondered where we went to last month. There was no April show, but there was a very good reason why there wasn't one.
Well, I like to think it was a good reason at any rate. So yeah, it was, I think maybe only a few days before you and I were planning on recording, and I was walking across the street, in downtown Chicago and got hit by a car. And so I was laid up in the hospital for about a week and then in a rehab facility for a couple of weeks after that. And have still, spent since that time, still spending a lot of time doing rehab in various forms. So, I had a bit of a challenge trying to get anything up and working here with, just being able to try and get back to walking and moving my arms, and all that fun stuff. So, but making progress going forward and, ready to get back into talking about some webcomics. So, I apologize to everybody for not being able to help record last month's show. We had a bunch of good stuff on the slate, but I think we got a lot of great stuff to look forward to this month as well.
That's right. Yeah. And I'm sure that all of our listeners understand. I mean, you can't help things like that, right? It was kind of freaky crossing the street and then getting hit by a car. I can't imagine. Yeah.
It's, not an experience I would recommend to anybody, quite frankly. It's not a fun one by any means. Just kind of walking across the street, minding your own business, and you see this guy speeding toward you all of a sudden out of nowhere. That's kind of a shock on several different levels.
Well, get better, my friend.
I'm working on it. On the plus side, didn't seem to impact my thinking capabilities, my speaking capabilities. So, I can still continue on with this kind of fun stuff.
Well, let's get into the fun stuff, which is looking at this year's nominees for the Best Webcomic category with the Eisner nominations 2018. And, you know, Sean, we did something like this almost exactly a year ago, where we looked at the webcomics that were nominated by that year, last year's judges for the Eisner Award. Although we didn't look just at the webcomics category, we also, if our listeners remember, looked at the best digital comics category. And if you recall, one of the things that was a little confusing, to say the least, we were glad that the Eisner judges finally made a distinction between digital comics and webcomics, because it was long in coming. However, last year, they seemed to have no understanding of what defined a digital comic and what defined a webcomic, because there were digital comics that were nominated under the webcomics category and webcomics that were nominated under the digital comics category. Right. So what we did with last year's episode is just pick out the various webcomics among those, or between those two categories, digital comic and webcomic, and then discuss those. And we also, I think, gently berated the judges and the Eisner people for their lack of understanding. Now, apparently their heart was in a good place in that they were making a distinction, or trying to, between digital and webcomic. They just weren't successful in carrying it through.
Well, it certainly looks like if they didn't listen to us specifically, they listened to people who said something similar, because it looks like this year they've done a pretty good job of splitting out webcomics and digital comics appropriately. And if you go through the digital comic lists, they all look to be digital comics, and you go through the webcomics list, they're pretty much all webcomics. And there is one I'll throw out there as maybe in kind of a gray area, but there is at least a better distinction, a much better distinction this year than there was last year.
Yeah, and I think the one you're referring to under Best Digital Comics is The Carpet Merchant of Constantinia, which is offered, if you go to that link that they provide, it's available both as a webcomic and as a digital comic, but we don't know which came first.
Right. Yeah, and legitimately it could be read as either. So I'll give him a pass on that one, especially given what we were looking at last year. So that's a definite improvement.
Well, there are 5 nominees under the Best Webcomic category, and Sean and I are going to be discussing all 5 of these. We may discuss them in order. We may jump around a bit. I think one of the things we definitely want to do is to talk about all 5 of them, definitely as a category. But also we want to pinpoint certain specific characteristics of each webcomic. And the 5 that we're going to be discussing are Awaiting a Wave, written by Dale Carpenter with art by Nate Powell, Brothers Bond by Kevin Griveau and Ryan Benjamin, Dispatch from a Sanctuary City by Mike Dawson, The T-Dragon Society by Katie O'Neill, and then Welcome to the New World by Jake Halpern and Michael Sloan. And of all 5 of them, only 2 of them are really the kind of webcomics that we usually discuss. In other words, the kind of webcomics that are serialized over a period of time and then available through, clicking through various web pages. And in fact, only one of those who were under nominations, Brothers Bond, is still ongoing.
Yeah, I was about to point that out. Most of these at this point are completed webcomics, and a good chunk of them were treated and written up basically as single installment pieces, where it was just presented as, here is my webcomic and it's however long it's going to be. And that's, there's no there's no need to come back over a period of weeks or months to continue the story. It's just to sit down and read it in one session kind of setup, which I think makes sense for those particular stories. But it's, as you pointed out, it's a little, different than what we usually talk about here on the show.
Right. And one of those webcomics that you just mentioned, kind of a done-in-one, is Mike Dawson's Dispatch from Sanctuary City, and this appears on the Nib, and it was released in April of last year. And so that's one that it's relatively short and contained. It doesn't take long to read it at all. Another one that is similar to that is done in one, like you were mentioning, is Dale Carpenter and Nate Powell's Awaiting the Wave. And this one, interestingly enough, of all places, appears on the Weather Channel's website. And in fact, it's part of the Weather Channel's 50 States, 50 Stories project. I don't know if you looked at this, Sean, but what it is if you look at the United States, you can click on a state, and then it will eventually take you to a story about weather changes, climate change, that's affecting that particular state. And the one for Arkansas is this webcomic, Awaiting a Wave. I think all the others, from what I can see, were more like typical news pieces or journalism pieces. And even though Awaiting a Wave, I do think it is a piece of journalism, it comes across much more as a webcomic than something more journalistic.
Yeah, and I think part of that is stems from, and I don't know, I'm not familiar with Dale Carpenter and his work, but I'm certainly familiar with Nate Powell, who obviously made a lot of waves and name for himself with the March trilogy.
Made waves? Pun intended?
Actually, that was not intended. That's how on the ball I am. My subconscious is working ahead of me at this point. But yeah, so Nate Powell did the March trilogy. What I guess it was passed over 3 or 4 years, something like that. And this kind of feels very much in the same vein. There's a historical element to it. There's a narrative that holds together very well. And it feels very much in kind of that same light. Obviously a different topic. We're talking about, it covers, well, let me step back a little bit, is even though this particular piece was, as you said, stems from the folks in Arkansas, it actually talks a little bit more about the Marshall Islands, which, and apparently I did not realize this, a lot of people from the Marshall Islands emigrated to Arkansas, particularly after the United States used those islands for some nuclear testing, and they helped move. I'm putting this very politically lightly here. They helped move a lot of the citizens over to the United States to resettle, and so there's a large Marshallese, I believe is the phrase, Marshallese population in this small town of Springdale, Arkansas, because that's where a lot of these people were moved to. And despite that, they're talking primarily about, why all these people are moving and continue to move, even though the United States is not doing any additional nuclear testing on these islands anymore. There's still a large number of Marshallese that are moving to Arkansas. And in part because, you see this in a lot of migrant populations. If you start a population, from a certain area, then they have those connections there and they can start bringing family and friends and whatever. And that population tends to grow. And so you get, the little Chinas of the world, right, in New York City and Chicago and all the other big cities, and the little Koreas and all of those kind of clusters of cultural emigrants. And Arkansas happens to have the same thing with Marshall Islands people.
Right. Now, you mentioned Nate Powell's credentials, and of course our listeners probably know who Nate Powell is.
Sure.
March and otherwise. Dale Carpenter, though, is a professor of journalism at the University of Arkansas, but he's also a documentary filmmaker. And I mentioned that because this webcomic does have a documentary feel to it. The way it begins is, at the very top of the page, it says, "Our Minister of Health is here to help us celebrate Constitution Day, the anniversary of the Republic of the Marshall Islands, founding on May 1st, 1979. This seems to be like an announcement at a festival. And then we get the first example of narration, direct narration by a character. "My name is Melissa Lalane. I'm not sure how you pronounce that name. I was born in the Marshall Islands. If I close my eyes, these sounds and smells make me almost believe I'm home on my island. There's just one thing missing: the ocean. This is not the Marshall Islands. This is Springdale, Arkansas." And then she goes on to describe what this festival is, a celebration, Constitution Day. And then for a while, she narrates what we need to know about everything that you were just mentioning, Sean, the fact that because of American nuclear testing, many Marshallese were moved or immigrated to the United States, specifically and for this location in this webcomic, Springdale, Arkansas, how people have found a life here, and how this narrator, Melissa, was in the military. Now she is someone who is a part of, I guess, a community elder or leader in certain ways. And then she introduces other people who then become narrators, sometimes briefly, sometimes in a more substantial way on their own. Because she tells us about someone named Cynthia Ricklon, and then Cynthia speaks for a while, and then we're introduced to Cynthia's brother, David, and then he narrates for a while. And then finally, in the last part of this webcomic, we're introduced to Chris Balos, B-A-L-O-S. Again, another immigrant of the Marshall Islands. And then he tells us his perspective and what he does. And what all of and then I think it ends back with Melissa. So it ends where it begins. And with all of these narrators, we're given information about what's going on in terms of the Marshall Islands and climate change, and how things are really affecting the island in such a way that people doubt if some of the things that they have held near and dear for generations will still be around. In fact, one of the last comments, I think, is Chris's mother says to him that she wants to be, when she dies, she wants to be buried back on the Marshall Islands. And Chris responds, "Well, don't you think that with climate change, the graves will be washed away?" And her response is, "Well, whatever you think is best." And that's a really sad way of ending things, or it almost ends the webcomic, but it's realistic. And so, I mean, there is kind of a stark tone to this webcomic, but they're supposed to be, given the political nature of what Awaiting a Wave is all about.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to a lot of different to aspects of that, in that, there's a very serious and heavy concern throughout the entire comic about climate change, generally speaking, and how the people of the Marshall Islands are dealing with it in a very day-to-day perspective, right? Because they're sitting there watching their front lawns disappear, and they're watching their highways disappear because they were too close to the sea and that kind of thing. And so there's a very real and practical approach to seeing climate change in action. That this is literally happening right now, right in front of our eyes. This is not something theoretical. But at the same time, it's still, there's still a little bit of hope and optimism, I think, in there, particularly, with Melissa, in that she goes on to say, and more than a couple of places, that it's not about, yes, that it's absolutely tragic that they're losing their land, they're losing their homes, the people are being forced to move, but at the same time, they're still keeping their cultural identity. And whether they're living on the Marshall Islands or in Springdale, Arkansas, they are still Marshallese, and they still have their culture, and they still have each other. And so it's not a completely kind of dystopic approach either. It's got that sense of optimism about the people, and that's what's more important than the fact that, we lost grandma's home.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I guess I was incorrect or a little too much of a downer by saying that this ends on kind of a stark note. But you're right, there is something a little more hopeful about it, because the way it ends, again, is Melissa, and she mentions to us, in fact, there's one panel when she's looking directly at us as readers. I feel like this is my Manet, which is Marshallese for culture. So I feel like this is my Manet. I feel like this is us. Yeah, we never left, and we're contributing to our country. We might not be there physically, but our heart is always going to be there, even if our islands are gone. And then that's how it ends. So there is something kind of hopeful at the end. I don't know, for some reason I was reminded of the very last part of Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, when he talks about Dilsey and his, I think, if I remember correctly, the last words of the Dilsey part is, she endured, or they endured. Mm-hmm. So despite everything, they're still going on. So you're right, there is something rather hopeful, but the information presented here is really, really striking. In fact, at the very end, there is a link for you to click on, and you get a series of maps, and these maps show you how the Marshall Islands are being affected by the rising water levels and flood threats and whatnot. So, that really does bring it all home.
Yeah, and this is nothing. Sadly, this is nothing new, too. I mean, there have been news stories about not just the Marshall Islands, but a lot of island countries that are talking about exactly the same thing, right? As they're seeing, their shorelines disappear because the sea levels are rising, and you're starting to you see that on just coastal cities in general. People are talking, about, are we going to have a Florida in another 40, 50 years just because, the sea levels will rise enough to encapsulate all of that as well.
Right.
So it's definitely a very real concern. And I think this comic goes a long way to putting it in practical terms, and putting a face to it. I think a lot of people, at least a lot of Americans, when they see or hear the news, they say, oh yeah, this island's going to disappear because of sea levels rising or whatever. And it gets kind of dismissed. But I think you take a piece like this, that puts a very real face on it. And it says, this is what's happening. These are real people that are really being affected. This is Chris and Melissa and the grandmother and everybody else. And these are the actual things that they're dealing with. They're talking about, literally seeing their homes washed their way. They're talking about literally not being able to be buried in their homeland because it's just not there anymore. And I think that puts a real face on it that I think a lot of people don't necessarily think about or appreciate in a lot of cases.
Now, I hesitate in what I'm about to say, but I'll say it nonetheless. My hesitation is I want to resist the urge of saying which webcomic I think is the best or some of my favorites, because I think each of them have something great to offer, and many of them do different things, although several of them do somewhat similar things. However, I do want to say that Awaiting a Wave strikes me as, for me as a reader, the most impactful. And part of that, I think, comes from Dale Carpenter's documentarian approach. I mean, it does have the feel of a documentary film in a way. But above that, Nate Powell's art. I am just a big fan of Nate Powell. We had him on the Comics Alternative a couple of years ago, and in fact, we're going to have him on later this year when his new book, Come Again, is released. He's agreed to come on the show and talk with us again. And I just love his lush art, and the way that he illustrates is perfect in terms of, let's say, the wave aspect, right? Because we see throughout this webcomic the ways in which the water levels are potentially washing away people's culture. But his style of illustration has this kind of sweeping nature like a wave. And so I think it's perfect for the kind of topic that Carpenter's writing about here.
Yeah. And I think it's easy to, I think it's it very easily falls in Powell's oeuvre, like, again, the same types of things that he was talking about in March. I mean, even though it's a different type of kind of political action and political history, it's still kind of treated the same way and still has that same level of both importance, significance, as well as that individuality and that personality and the personalness of the story itself.
Yeah. Now, that being said, I'm also a fan of Mike Dawson, so I feel kind of bad saying, hey, I really like Awaiting the Wave because of Nate Powell's work. I also like Mike Dawson's Dispatch from a Sanctuary City. And again, this appeared on the Nib. I think it was released in April of last year. And this is also a political webcomic. And in fact, it's one of the three that we see. We've already mentioned Awaiting a Wave. We have Dawson's Dispatch from a Sanctuary City. And then later on, we can talk about Halpern and Sloan's Welcome to the New World. And I don't know, looking at these three together, this is 3 out of the 5 webcomics that have an overt political impact and message baked into them. And so it makes me wonder what the judges for the Eisner Awards this year were thinking and what they privileged, or at the same time, what they were exposed to. Because one of the things we don't know is, and I don't know if we want to speculate about this at some point on this episode, but what kind of webcomics were the judges given? And I know that creators can nominate themselves. Of course, publishers can nominate titles. But I'm curious how much research the judges themselves did in terms of webcomics, because really when it comes right down to it, we don't have much variety in this year's nominees. They seem to be, I mean, they're great webcomics, but for the most part, they seem to be of a type. There's not much variation. There's not much variety. And that had me wondering what the judges were looking at and how they looked. Because, I mean, as you and I know, I mean, there are, you especially, tons and tons of webcomics out there. And so how do you limit all of that? I mean, it seems to me that trying to decide on what webcomics to choose for nominees would be a much more difficult task than, let's say, more regular comics, comic books, graphic novels, what have you.
Yeah, my guess is, and honestly, I do not have any particular insight into this, but my guess is that a lot of what was even submitted this year was of a political persuasion. I think there's, and I don't have any numbers to back this up by any means, but I get the sense that there's a lot more political type messaging going out via webcomics today than there has been in the past. And for a variety of reasons, number one of which just the political climate in general, right? I think there's a very direct and overt reaction to everything that's going on in Washington, D.C. right now, and for that matter, Great Britain and Europe in general.
Don't forget Russia.
And Russia and, the whole planet at this point, really, right? So I think there's, not that there's necessarily, more political webcomics than there are other types of webcomics, but I think there are more political webcomics now than there have been in the past. So I think it makes sense that we're seeing more of that, if for no other reason than there's just more out there. And I don't know if that means that necessarily more of them have been nominated this year. I don't know if that's instead there's the same number that were nominated, but the judges are kind of thinking more along political lines than they would be historically. But it doesn't surprise me at all to see among the webcomics here a larger percentage of political comics than we've seen in the past.
That's a good point, and that makes sense. And another thing that I don't know is how much research the judges do on their own. In other words, in addition to submissions, official nominations, right? People suggesting, hey, check this out, or I'd like to nominate this one for an award. I'm also curious about their parameters. In other words, this is for, it's a 2018 Eisner. So this is for material that came out in 2017. However, there are one or two of these titles that began in 2016. So what is the criteria in terms of when something was released? And then along with that, when it comes to longer form webcomic storytelling, and you and I have looked at many of these, right? Webcomics that began years ago. Would something that began, let's say, 6, 7, even 10 years ago, but it's still ongoing, would it be considered for the current year's Eisner Award under the webcomic category? Mm-hmm. In other words, as with many things when it comes to the Eisner nominations, we just don't know about it. We don't know what the judges decide on or what they're told to look at and consider, what's off limits, what they should privilege, and what have you. Not that that's necessarily important, but I don't know. I'm curious about it in terms of webcomics, especially given the fact that the Eisners do not have a very good track record, and not just with last year, when it comes to understanding what webcomics are all about. So I'd be curious to know what they were thinking about, and again, what kind of research the judges did on their own. I mean, could they bring in their own nominees? I would guess so, but again, I don't know. I've never been a judge. Maybe we can ask our friend Carol Tilley about this.
All right, I would say we just give Jackie Estrada a call, and
yeah.
you know what? We should bring her on the show at some point and just talk to her for an hour or something, and get the whole lowdown on everything Eisner's and San Diego in general.
That would be interesting.
Even beyond just the webcomics discussion, I think that would be an interesting, because obviously she's been running that for I don't know how many years, or is it even decades at this point? So, I think there'd be a long, interesting discussion available there, even just beyond the webcomics aspect.
Okay. It would be, with this reservation, it would be difficult for me not to confront her with her prejudice against podcasts.
Fair enough.
And yeah. I would, I don't know. Sometimes I tend to go off on a little soapbox type tirade when it comes to that. And I will not say anything about that now. Okay. I've already said this on the podcast episode, in the past. But getting back to the matter at hand, Mike Dawson's dispatch, although that is a good idea, asking her to come on the show at some point. But Mike Dawson's dispatch from Sanctuary City. And then the subtitle of this is White Rage in Red Bank. And I'm assuming that Mike is writing about Red Bank, New Jersey.
Presumably, yeah. I think it was a vague reference to Jersey at some point, but I don't recall seeing. Okay. I don't recall exactly where it was.
Yeah, I couldn't remember where it was mentioned in the webcomic, and I looked up Red Bank, like where's Red Bank, and there is a Red Bank in Jersey, so that may be where this is. And basically, this is a webcomic about, well, what the title suggests. It's about the city of Red Bank and many of its citizens wanting to make it a sanctuary city. And then Dawson even goes into what that means, right? Because we hear the term sanctuary city, but we may not know what goes into a town becoming a sanctuary city, what defines one. And he tells us. At the same time, he also introduces us to more conservative members of the community who are, shall we say, on board the Trump train, right? So they're spouting anti-immigrant ignorance when it comes right down to it, and are quite reactionary without being judicious in terms of, or even humane in terms of considering the question of whether Red Bank should become a sanctuary city. And this is another example of not only a political webcomic, but also one that has very much a journalistic feel to it. Because we actually see throughout Dawson writing up what he's telling us. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, literally his hands on the keyboard. Drawings of his hands on the keyboard as he's typing this stuff out. Yeah.
Yes.
But at the same time, he's also very clear that it has got that journalistic bent, but he also has a very clear point of view that he's getting across. And he's very clear in that, the sanctuary city people are right, and the people, the bigots and racists who are saying, who are protesting against this are wrong. And he's very clear on that point. He's making no qualms about where he stands on this matter. So even though it's taking this journalistic approach, it's not unopinionated either.
Yes, exactly. And you're right. Of the, I guess the three overtly political webcomics that were nominated, again, Awaiting a Wave, Dispatch from a Sanctuary City, and Welcome to the New World, I do think that Mike Dawson's Dispatch from a Sanctuary City is the most overtly political in terms of where the creator's sympathies lie, and that's fine. In other words, I mean, he is trying to be judicious, right? He is giving voice to alternative conservative voices, to where his sympathies would lie. But I mean, you can definitely tell where his sympathies lie.
Well, yeah, he makes very explicit comparisons between those people and the same people who, 100 years ago were saying, hell, let's get the Irish out of here because they're all drunks and assholes. And 50 years ago, hey, let's get the black people out of here because they're less than human or something. And he makes very explicit comparisons and saying, these MAGA folks are in exactly the same vein as those people who were, putting Japanese in internment camps back in the 40s and spitting on black students trying to walk into an integrated school in the 60s. He's saying these are the same people. This is no different than what we've seen in America's past before. We've seen this over and over again, and it always looks ugly in retrospect, and it looks ugly now.
Yes. And in fact, to me, that was the most compelling part of this webcomic. About halfway through, there is one protester in the crowd, a conservative, who is yelling to the crowd, "Pay your taxes." And then Dawson writes, and the words are right underneath, "We've seen this face before." And then he transitions into that part that you just described, right? And the thing that's so striking about this is when he recalls the connections between what's going on today and what had happened in the past, not only with African Americans, but also with other immigrants, right? Those from other ethnic communities. He represents, for the most part, the past in black and white, whereas the rest of the webcomic is in color. And so we do get these repeated images of I guess it's the Brown versus Board of Education actions that went on at the time, and we're also given the Japanese internment images. The one image in this series of black and white panels that is not black and white, that has a light green to it, is with the caricature of the Irishman. Other than that, though, I mean, it's the black and white, the change to black and white is Dawson's way of making the connection between past and present. And then after this black and white section, we're taken back to this guy with the big fuzzy mustache yelling something about paying your taxes, shown to be the hypocrite that he's represented at. And then Dawson peppers the rest of the webcomic with some of these other ends it with a couple of other black and white images, again, making this connection between the present and the past, which again, I think is quite an effective way of making his point. And then the very last panel, which is the exclamation mark, if you will, on his statement, is a young woman holding a sign that says, "No human being is illegal."
Yeah. The only question I have about this in general is, as it goes to the audience for this, in that I think there are a lot of people who, would totally, and I think you and I fall in this category, totally sympathize with Dawson's message here, right? And we're all on the same page. You're like, yep, he is right on all of this, and all that stuff in the past was garbage and shouldn't have happened, and it's garbage now and it shouldn't be happening. And I think a lot of those people would read this and just say, perfect, thumbs up, good job. That's exactly what I want to read, and confirms everything that I believe in. And I think there's anybody who is on the other side of the fence is going to read this and say, well, that's bullshit, and just totally dismiss it right off the bat, right? Because, there's tons of examples, that Dawson is not the first person to make these comparisons, right? He does a good job of it here, but he's not original in that sense. And those comparisons have been ignored by that group of people already. So I don't know that he's reaching out to them at all. So I guess my question ends up being, in terms of the audience, is who does this really need to speak to? Because if you're on either side of this, it's not going to change your mind, right? As you're already for this and you're in favor of this 100%, and you don't need any of this information because you've already read something to this effect, or you're totally against this and this is all bullshit and you're dismissive of it anyway. And I don't know that at this point in 2018 that there are a whole lot of people that kind of fall in the middle anywhere. And so I don't know. That's kind of the one. It's like, again, it's not that it's badly done. It's not that it's badly written. I just don't know if the people that need to get this message are any more receptive to this message because of this particular comic versus any other comic or any other journalism piece or any other news article or any other documentary or what have you that's already been done and talked about the same thing.
That's a good point. And I hadn't really thought about that when I read Dispatch from a Sanctuary City. But, the Nib is, among other things, known for putting out these kind of comics, right? These politically weighted comics and politically in terms of a particular side, right? I mean, much more liberal than conservative. Sure. And there's nothing wrong with that. So the people who are going to come to the Nib, and the Nib has always been one of those sites that I feel I should read on a more regular basis, but I don't. And so it's only when people alert me to something or I see a reference to something on the Nib that I'll go and look at it, like this one from Mike Dawson. And you're right. I mean, this is a great webcomic. I really like what Mike is doing. In fact, we've even had Mike on the show before. We had him maybe 2 years ago when his book, Rules for Dating My Daughter, came out.
Okay, yeah.
So, yeah, great guy. I like this. Makes sense that it's on the Nib because you know what to expect from the Nib.
Sure, yeah.
And you're right. It may not be speaking to audiences who probably need more of a message like this. But on the other hand, I kind of liken it to, people who watch MSNBC watch it for a particular reason, and that reason is more times than not because they have similar political sympathies. And you can say the same thing with Fox, right?
Sure.
People watch Fox because for similar reasons why people watch MSNBC, because it kind of affirms or it gives comfort to what they already believe. And, we could go off on a tangent about, whether this is a negative thing that has developed over the past 10, 15 years or so in terms of our entertainment and our news or not. If it's something that just makes sense now, I don't know. But you're right. The people who go to the Nib on a regular basis are going to be much more sympathetic to this.
Right.
I don't think that takes away from the impact of this webcomic, though.
It depends on I think that the impact depends on the audience. It's, I guess my question is, does this have an impact if you're already in line with that messaging? Cause think about this. I know there's a meme going around on Facebook currently, about, 10 influential albums that, it had a big impact on you as a kid or whatever. Something to that effect. And it's not to say, and, people are posting stuff about here are these albums that were really powerful and spoke to me when I first heard them. And it's not that they're saying, hey, you know what? Michael Jackson's Thriller album was irrelevant because I didn't list it. It's just that it didn't speak to me at that time, or I wasn't available in the time frame, or, it didn't have any impact on me because I'd already been impacted by these other things. So I wonder that I don't know. I'm just kind of, wondering if, again, like you said, the audience for the Nib is already kind of left leaning, progressive in general. So does this say anything additional to them? Does this give them anything more that they weren't already aware of before reading it? That's what I don't know.
Yeah. And that's a good question. Now, maybe it would be good to move on to the third of these politically motivated comics that were nominated for this year's Eisner Award for Best Webcomic, and that is Jake Halpern and Michael Sloan's Welcome to the New World. And Michael Sloan is the illustrator. Jack Halpern is the writer. I think he's a journalist. And this is interesting. This is a webcomic that was serialized, I believe, between January of 2017 and then September of 2017. So they're 19 installments. And it originally appeared in the New York Times Sunday Review. And so there is a serial nature to this. And it's the story of a Syrian family who makes its way to the United States because of political reasons, right? They want not only to survive, but they also want to make sure that their children, it's a husband and wife, make sure that they grow up and have opportunities that maybe they didn't have, and that the kids definitely wouldn't have back home. So it's really fascinating in terms of the subject matter. I'll admit, though, Sean, that at first I was prejudiced against this webcomic, and the reason why is misinformation. And not all, but most of the misinformation came from the Eisner website, or the Comic-Con Eisner Award nominations website. Because if you go there, they provide hyperlinks to all these webcomics, with the one exception of Welcome to the New World. Because if you click on the link that they provide, it takes you to Michael Sloan's website where he mentions Welcome to the New World. So you go there, and it's really interesting. You and I had different experiences in reading this webcomic, because that first paragraph on Michael Sloan's website, it says, "The author Jake Halpern and I worked on Welcome to the New World, a comic strip that documents the lives of Syrian refugee family who have recently arrived in the U.S. This comic appeared as 20, I think it was 19 though, episodes over 10 months in the New York Times Sunday Review. You can see all the episodes on the New York Times website." Now, there's a hyperlink to the New York Times website. Initially, that's what I clicked on. And so I started to read the installments. And of course, they don't make it easy to go from one panel to the next, because each of these pieces, the installments of this story, Welcome to the New World, is, according to, I guess, what the New York Times does on their site, an individual story. Right? Mm-hmm. So I clicked on one, the first one, and I read it. Clicked on the second, I read that. And I think after about 4, maybe 5 articles, which translates into 4 or 5 installments of Welcome to the New World, then I couldn't read anymore, because the New York Times said I needed to subscribe to read more than 4 or 5 articles.
Yeah, it's the paywall setup that they have set up on the New York Times website. Yeah.
Exactly. So then what I did, I went from my tablet to my desktop and read 5 more installments. Then the paywall came up. Then what I did was I went into my web browser's preferences and cleaned out all the cookies to where I could finish reading it. And I had to clean out the cookies like 2 or 3 more times. And that pissed me off. And then later, as you and I were setting up to discuss this show, you said, "Oh, well, I saw the webcomic on just one page where I could scroll through everything." What you had clicked on was on Sloan's website. It says, again, the author Jake Halpern and I worked on Welcome to the New World, a comic strip that documents. There is a hyperlink to the title Welcome to the New World. And if you click on that, that takes you to the entire webcomic. Mm-hmm. And I don't know. I just found that a little confusing, because if you want to read the webcomic, as Sloan indicates on his site, you can see it at the New York Times website. But then that caused problems. But then going back even further, it's the people at the Eisner, whoever maintains this website, who gave, in essence, an incorrect hyperlink. or didn't give the most expedited, let's say, hyperlink. And so I don't know, that left me with kind of a bad feeling when I was reading this. And some may think, oh, well, that's really not fair of you, Derek. But remember, Sean, you and I talk on our webcomic show every month, not only about the content and the art, right? But we also talk about the navigability of a particular webcomic,
Sure.
And that, I think, goes into what makes a successful webcomic, as well as the content, the writing and art and all of that, but also how you can find information, archives, pages, what have you, on a website. So it's not made easy to read Welcome to the New World.
Yeah, and that's disappointing. I'm not sure if, again, going back to that discussion we had earlier about some of the opacity of the organization, the Eisner organization in the first place. I don't know who decided that was the link that they should go to. If that was something that Mike Sloan specifically sent them, or if that was something that one of the Eisner judges plugged in, or if that was just a miscommunication between the Eisner judges and the guy who was working on the webpage, right?
Right.
And that is unfortunate because it gives you that predisposition to being in a bad mood and not liking the webcomic before you've even started reading it. Separate from whether or not it's a good comic or not, separate from the content, that predisposes you to a bad experience, which is unfortunate. Because the story itself, as you kind of mentioned earlier, is basically this family that is not only emigrating to America as refugees, from Jordan, but they also do so literally right during the 2016 election.
Yeah, as fate would have it.
Yeah, they left on November 5th, just before, and arrived on, I think November 8th, the day after, so it's like right exactly that time. And there's a lot of discussion on, within the story chronicles, this family's trip and not, once they get here, moving into a house and trying to integrate with the community, as well as still keeping contacts with their family back home, because not the entire family didn't move. They left, grandma and some of the brothers and sisters, the older brothers and sisters and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of the discussion around that, but also there's a huge amount of uncertainty going on even within the comic, because like I said, they arrive the day after they find out the world's biggest bigot is now in the most powerful office in the country. Yeah. And just as they're stepping on the shores. So they don't know if they're going to get kicked back or not, because he had an entire platform that said, let's kick these people out. So there's a lot of questions that they have and a lot of uncertainty. Excuse me. And that goes to a lot of the storytelling here and trying to show that, this is the life of a refugee. This is the kind of stuff that they have to deal with, even though you might think, okay, yeah, we just fly them over here and drop them in a house and they're good to go. Well, that's not exactly what's going on. Especially with conditions like these that they have to deal with.
Right. And by the way, I just checked and I was wrong. It's not 19 parts. There are 20 parts. Okay. To the story. So, you were talking about the content of the story itself, and I think it's a compelling narrative. And what Halpern and Sloan are doing here is great. And in fact, they won a 2018 Pulitzer in the editorial cartooning category for this webcomic, Welcome to the New World. So congratulations to them. Pulitzer
absolutely.
Winner.
Absolutely.
One thing, though, or actually there are a couple of things about this webcomic that, if not confuse me, then have me wondering why make the decisions that they made as creators. The first thing is, in part 5, we are introduced to the immigrant family's other family. In other words, so the father of the family that moves from, the Syrian family who moves from Jordan to the United States, his name is Jamil. And then Jamil has a brother who his family is already living in the United States. And so they moved to the same city as Jamil, not like next door or anything, but, within driving distance. And Jamil's brother is Amar. And so in part 5, Jamil and his family goes to see Amar and his family. And of course, there's a lot of hugging, glad to see you, we'll have to stay in contact, and, all of that. After that, it's not as if we see much of Jamil and his family anymore. It seems to focus more on Amar. And as I was reading this for the first time, it took me a little while to realize, hey, this is not the same guy with a mustache that we're following. This is his brother and his family. Because the story that follows after part 5, for all practical purposes, primarily focuses on Amar and his family and what they go through. Mm-hmm. Which I found a little strange, because if the focus is on this family that has just emigrated to the United States, why not follow that through? Because I'm sure that what they're learning, what they're having to go through, is as compelling, at least as compelling, as the brother's family who's already been in the United States for a while. So I'm wondering about that narrative focus, that shift from one family to the other. What were they thinking? What does it bring them in terms of making that focalized shift? Now, another question that I have about this webcomic is the ending. There really is no ending. It's I don't want to say it's a series of episodes or it's episodic, because it's not. I mean, there are things that happen in one part that continue on and influence what happens in another. But the last installment we get, I guess, is in September of 2017, and it just seems to end. There's no wrap-up. It's not like I need an official and they all lived happily ever after the end kind of ending, right? I mean, I love ambiguous endings, but even given the fact that this may or may not be an ambiguous ending, it doesn't seem to be much of an ending. Yeah,
it really just, it literally ends with, them kind of remembering, here was the house that we left in, I think it's, one of the other relatives that hasn't moved, starts sending them photos back. And here's basically saying, look, your house has been ransacked and bombed and there's almost nothing left. It's rubble. And then they just kind of go through a couple of remembrances about that. And, oh, look, I still have the key to the house. And that's it, and it seems like, it seems like there should be an additional epilogue there or something that just says, it seems like it's, they kind of understood, they come to the, both Amar and Jamil's families kind of come to the understanding of, okay, that life that we had is completely unobtainable anymore. There's no way we can go back. This is, not only have we moved into America now, we don't even have a home back home. This is a permanent situation. They kind of come to that understanding and they come to that realization, it seems like. But then, then there's this kind of hanging notion of, this, it just kind of trails off as people kind of talk about that. And it's like, I guess we can't go home. And, there seems like it's right around an ending, but not quite somehow. Yeah. Right. And then also some of the things that Amar and his family go through in terms of the threats and whatnot. Mm-hmm. We don't get much of a resolution from those. I mean, in terms of being threatened and having to move, I mean, they move. So you could argue, well, that's a resolution, right? I don't know. I didn't feel in reading this that was something that was followed up on. It was just kind of left. In other words, there are a lot of things that are going on with his family, and throughout this webcomic, Welcome to the New World, we see the various things that the family goes through without really following through completely many of the endeavors and the hardships that the families are undergoing. Yeah. And, I'm wondering, I mentioned this one, the 2018 Pulitzer for Best Editorial Cartooning. Again, I'm wondering about judges, not the judges of the Eisners this year, but the judges of the Pulitzer. I'm sure that people who evaluate editorial cartoons for a Pulitzer are used to comics that are like
single panel, done in one, what have you, right? Because that's mostly what editorial cartooning is. This is a different kind of editorial cartoon. It's one that is definitely narrative. Now, you could argue that single panel political cartoons have elements of narrative. Yeah, okay. That can be the case. But this is a longer form story would be maybe a better way of putting it. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering if there, I don't want to say lack of awareness of a conclusion or even an epilogue, as you suggested, was there. They may not have even missed it. I don't know. It's an impactful story, and I think it has a powerful message. I'm just wondering about some of the narrative decisions. Again, the ending and then that shift in terms of focus from one family to the other without any apparent purpose. And if there is a purpose, I wish someone would tell me.
Yeah, the only thing I can guess with that is that I can see why they started with Jamil's family, because
right,
because that's going on literally during the election. It's almost impossible to pass that up as a narrative opportunity. But yeah, then the shift seems a little odd. The only thing I can think of there is that Jamil's family, for whatever reason, once we get to that point in their story, Jamil's story is decidedly less interesting for some reason.
Yeah, and it's like Jamil and his family provide, or only there as a narrative device.
Yeah,
it seems to be.
Yeah,
from what you just said.
And I don't know. I'm kind of guessing on that. I don't know how. I don't know how or why any of those decisions were made. I don't know how. It's allegedly more or less a true story. I don't know how accurate any of that is. If that's one thing I find with a lot of biographies in general in comics, is there's always this balance of trying to find a way of telling the story compelling and narratively and still being true to what actually happened. And I think a lot of people run into problems with that. A lot of comic artists run into problems with that because they either want to be so true to the story, to what actually happened, that the storytelling starts falling apart because, they're using actual quotes that were said by this guy and we have them documented and that, or it's, they take so many fictional liberties that it kind of doesn't have that ring of truth about it at all when it's done. And I know I've run into that with a lot of comics that have any sort of biographical bent to them. I've seen a lot of creators have difficulty balancing that. And I wonder if some of that's going on here too, in that they wanted to tell the story of Jamil, but then got to halfway through and realized, oh wait, it kind of doesn't get that interesting after this point. And so they had to switch over to Amar or something like that. I don't know. I'm kind of guessing, but, it may have been that kind of situation.
Well, the past 3 webcomics that we've discussed in detail, Awaiting a Wave, Dispatch from a Sanctuary City, and Welcome to the New World, are not only more overtly political than the other 2 that are nominated this year for the best webcomic category. They're also journalistic pieces in many ways.
Yeah. Now,
the other 2 titles that are nominated for the best webcomic category this year, Brothers Bond and the Tea-Dragon Society, are very different or strikingly different. In fact, these are the kind of webcomics that, for the most part, you and I tend to gravitate toward every month when we do a webcomics episode.
Right.
Not that we haven't looked at done-in-one and even political webcomics. We have in the past. It's just usually we tend to look at webcomics that are serialized. And usually over a longer period. That's what we have with Brothers Bond by Kevin Graveau and Ryan Benjamin and Tea-Dragon Society by Katie O'Neill. Now, the Tea-Dragon Society by Katie O'Neill, and our listeners can find this at Tea-Dragon Society, one word, TEA dragonsociety.com. It's a short webcomic. It's only 46 pages long. It ran from September of 2016 to September of 2017. And, this is actually printed in book form, and this came out, I think, in October of last year from Oni Press. But apparently, the webcomic is also by Oni Press. At least that's what it seems like. I didn't know that Oni Press did anything with webcomics. I mean, did you? Am I reading this correctly?
I got the impression that they didn't necessarily publish it as a webcomic per se, but they maybe had an agreement somehow with Katie in the first place that it would be published as a printed book after she completed the webcomic or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So my guess is, again, having no real knowledge of the behind the scenes workings on here, is that this is something that they were aware of from the time Katie started it. But not necessarily, they weren't, I don't know how much help they gave her in the actual publication, in the web publication of the comic, other than just saying, hey, you know what, when you're done with this, we'll do a printed version for you.
And as a result, they give them the Oni Press stamp.
Right.
And literally the image that Katie O'Neill can put on her website. Because this doesn't appear on the Oni website. It's at, I'm assuming, Katie O'Neill's own website, tdragonsociety.com. Now, if that's the case, then I have to applaud Oni Press, because what a lot of presses will do is when something originally ran as a webcomic, and then they get a publisher that will put out a hard copy of what had been a webcomic, they ask the creator either to take the entire webcomic down or to significantly truncate it. Mm-hmm. And I can understand why they do that, right? Because if people can get something for free, why would they buy the hard copy book? This case, though, Oni apparently allowed O'Neill, and maybe they had an agreement before, to keep this webcomic up, which I appreciate.
Yeah.
Because I think, just because something is available as a webcomic and there's a book, a hard copy book, doesn't mean that I'm not going to get the book. I mean, I prefer hard copy texts. So even if it's still available as a webcomic, if I want and if I can, I'll get the book. I maybe have the webcomic as a backup, but I like the fact that O'Neill's T-Dragon Society is available as a hard copy book, and it's still available as a webcomic.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate that too. And I have to assume that at least part of that is because they realize it's not terribly long, and you can't put a good, I think it would be difficult to put a good sampling of this story up without putting up the whole thing.
Right.
Because it's not, the story is I think it might make sense if we talk about the story a little bit here first. So the story is largely about a young girl named Greta, and she is apprenticing to be a blacksmith, but she's not terribly into it. She's kind of, okay, I'm doing this because I have to, kind of thing.
Her mother's a blacksmith.
Yeah, her mother's a blacksmith, so she's kind of forced into it almost. And through a series of events, she basically stumbles upon what's, I guess, is called the remnants of what was the T-Dragon Society, which were a group of people who created and enjoyed making tea from, I don't know, leaves, I guess, or fur of dragons.
Right, these little dragons, not big ones, not big scary ones, but little cute ones.
Yeah, we're not talking Smaug here. We're talking more like My Little Pony kind of version of dragons.
Yeah.
And it was just a small cultural thing. This society of people who enjoyed tea, this particular brand of tea, which apparently is evidently very difficult to produce, which is why more people aren't into it. And so Greta, kind of learns of this and becomes involved with this and realizes the importance of carrying on these traditions. Just because that they're not necessary in the way that they may have used to have been. They're still valuable, right?
Right.
So there's this, it's kind of it's not a grand adventure or anything, even though we're talking about dragons. You don't expect any large sword fights or, damsels in distress and fire breathing and all that. It's a fairly quiet story.
Yeah.
And because
that's a good way of describing it.
Yeah. And because of that, and coupled with the length, the fairly short length, going back to my original point, I think it would be difficult to truncate this story in a way that you could put a little bit of it online and get a sense of what the story is about. You know, if you even take a third of the story, I think you're really missing out on what the story is about. I don't think you could take like the first, whatever a third of 46 would be. It's, a first, 20 pages or first 15 pages or whatever. You just read 15 pages and yeah, it's, you get, okay, yeah, she can tell a story, she can draw. But you don't get a sense of where the story is overall. You don't get a sense of the bigger picture on what this is about. So I think from Oni's perspective, they felt they either it was kind of an all or nothing choice. They either had to put everything on there or have nothing on there.
Right. Well, they didn't have to have any of it on there. I mean, they could have asked her, it's like, hey, we're going to publish this as a book. Take your webcomic down. And then you can maybe provide a hyperlink over to the Oni website or to Amazon or wherever people can purchase the book. But you're right. I mean, this is not that long. And so why not keep it up? I mean, one could argue.
Yeah.
And I guess its length kind of surprised me. I think when I first looked at this webcomic, I saw that it was only 40-some pages, 46? But still, having read it, I was a little surprised that it ended so quickly. Now, that doesn't mean that it takes away from the story. I think it's a kind of a nice little narrative. You mentioned the protagonist Greta falling into this tea dragon society. She comes across the I guess the home of, how do you pronounce his name? Hezekiel, who is a tea merchant.
I was thinking Ezekiel, kind of more of a
okay,
like a Jewish, historically Jewish name.
Yeah, I mean that would make sense. We don't have a Z though; it's an S. Hezekiel. Okay, yeah, that phonetically I guess makes more sense than whatever the hell I said. So he's a tea merchant and proprietor of a tea shop that she stumbles upon, and he's living with someone who works with him, who I guess is Hezekiel's significant other, a guy or an individual named Eric. And so she learns the craft of making tea with tea dragons. And, earlier you mentioned that her mother is a blacksmith. I found that there are quite a number of parallels between blacksmithing and tea dragon tea making, because both Hezekiel and Greta's mother talk to Greta about the long, rich tradition of what they do, whether it be making dragon tea or blacksmithing, and how it needs to be done with its history and its significance in mind and respected as a craft. And so both of those messages are similar. And so in essence, Greta just goes from one craft and one trade to another. And so she would learn the same lesson, whether it be from her mother or Hezekiel and Eric.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting then is she recognizes that towards the end too.
Right.
As once she's sat down and gone through the various education, I guess, for learning how to make this dragon tea. She starts to recognize, oh, wait, I can apply these same lessons to blacksmithing. I can apply these same lessons to having a picnic, to, doing whatever else she does in life, which may not be, again, not the most, in demand or, fastest or technically most efficient way of doing things anymore. But she can recognize the importance and value in the tradition and the culture and the history behind some of these things that some people don't want to get lost. And with good reason, I think.
Yeah. And, this is, I used the word nice earlier. I want to underscore that. This is a nice story. It's short. It's sweet. I don't know if it goes out on a limb in any way. We've been talking about, for most of this podcast episodes, political comics. This is definitely not that. It is low key, kind of quiet. And again, short. So it doesn't take long to read at all. And, I can't help but wonder, getting back to my earlier ponderance of what the judges are doing and what they're considering and how they're going about winnowing down to what to nominate. I wonder if length is something that they consider either consciously or unconsciously. So, for instance, if there is this really long ongoing webcomic, are they not reading it just because it takes so long to read? And you and I know that some of these webcomics that have been going on for quite a while can be very time consuming.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And so it's interesting that all of the ones, political or otherwise, that are nominated this year are short, either done in one or short in terms of their completion, as is the case with T-Dragon Society, or even short in terms of what we have so far, which is the case with Brothers Bond.
I wonder, here's a thought that just strikes me. I wonder if one of the qualifications in the judge's mind is that the bulk of the work had to have been published in the year, in whatever year that you're discussing, 2017 in this case. Cause like you pointed out, this particular comic did technically start in 2016, but the bulk of it ran in 2017. And I wonder if that's the consideration. And that's why you don't see, some of these longer form comics that have been around for 10 years, because the bulk of it was not published in any single year at this point. We've got, the bulk of something that's been going for that long would have been published well before 2017. And you've only got essentially a small snippet of the overall story to work with within 1 year. And I wonder if that's why we don't see longer webcomics, showing up in the Eisners every year.
That's a good question. And I had thought of that, but then I knew that in many of the other categories for the Eisner Award, we get nominees from series that have been going on for quite a long time. It's just that either there's something that goes on in that series, for, in this case, last year, that really stands out, or there is a particular issue, maybe of an ongoing comic book series, that stands out. And so those are nominated. But maybe they wouldn't give the same kind of consideration to a webcomic, feeling that that's something that is best appreciated in its entirety. So that comes back to your question, right? Does the bulk of the narrative need to have come out, in this case, last year in 2017 for the 2018 awards? I don't know. But if that's the case, if they're not treating webcomics the same way that they're treating, let's say, print publications, regardless of when they start, what year that they start, that may be just yet another misunderstanding, and also a misappreciation of webcomics. I don't know. We're just speculating here. And one of the things I don't like to do, because I don't like comics podcasts where you have fanboy speculation. That really gets on my nerves. It's like, you don't know, so quit speculating. And I don't want to go down that path. So who knows what kind of parameters go into the judge's decision?
Yeah.
It just strikes me that all of these webcomics nominated this year are very short, either done in one or not much to read. Now, again, I don't want to take away from O'Neill's T-Dragon Society at all, but it is a short comic that is relatively quickly consumable. As is one that we really haven't talked about in much detail yet, and this is Kevin Grevioux and Ryan Benjamin's Brothers Bond. I'm not sure how you pronounce Kevin's name. It's Grevioux.
I'm just going to stick with
Grevioux.
I'm just going to stick with Kevin.
Now, this is something that appears on Webtoon, and we've talked about several Webtoon webcomics in the past. And it started in November of 2017, and it's still ongoing, and it's up to episode 15, which came out on February 21st of this year. So it may be on hiatus right now.
Yeah, I did.
But it's still ongoing.
Yeah, he does have a note somewhere in there about being on hiatus for a little bit. Although, although he does say something about, it did strike me. I don't have it in front of me. I can't find it at the moment, but he did say something about going on hiatus for just a month or two. And I'm like, looking at, we're here sitting here recording this on May 10th, and I'm thinking, I think you missed your date for coming back. And hey, who am I to complain? I just started the show at the top here saying why we didn't do a webcomics episode last month. I know stuff gets in the way. I've always said that even before my accident last month, but, just point, he did knowingly go on a hiatus. It just looks like it's taking a little bit longer than he anticipated.
Right. Now, this is very briefly described on the site as an exiled prince and his two blind samurai protectors set on a dangerous journey to reclaim their kingdom from demonic forces. And I guess in a nutshell, that's what this webcomic will be, although there's some of that we haven't seen yet. So, for instance, the demonic forces we get hints of over the course of the first, 15 episodes and even in the prologue. But there's not yet a confrontation between the exiled prince and the blind samurai. So we have basically two stories going on. The main one being the prince, and what is the prince's name? Oh, Yoshi.
Yeah.
And then the two samurai who take Yoshi under their wing, the two blind samurai, Sato and Tanaka. And much of the story that we have so far is, Yoshi, I don't know, they describe it as exiled. He just runs away. He did something that his emperor father didn't like, and he's kind of scared of the reaction, and he just runs away. And so he gets lost, and he's taken in by these samurai. And then he's trained by the samurai over time. He kind of grows up with them. But then every now and again, we get little bits of information about these evil forces, the demonic forces as they're described. And they're primarily embodied in, I guess, an entity called Lunge. It's spelled Lung, but I wouldn't call it lung.
So that
doesn't sound too scary.
It didn't sound scary to me either. It struck me as a little odd, but I went with lung just because that's how I would read it in English. So I don't know.
Now, you mentioned how you would read it in English. These are obviously Western creators, at least obvious from their names, but it does have a manga feel to it, as a lot of webcomics tend to do, I think, at times.
Sure.
And also, given the subject matter, samurai, and the kind of fighting that goes on, it does have a semi-manga-like feel, I guess.
Yeah, and I think at some point, I think it was Ryan even notes that that's very deliberate. That's the stuff he grew up on and he appreciates and enjoys. And I think he does a good job of emulating those ideas without seeming like an overt ripoff of, Naruto or something like that. He's not just aping a particular artist's style or a particular story or something like that. But there's clear influences in there. But he's not just saying, oh yeah, I can copy these drawings out of Akira. I'll just do that.
Right.
He's definitely got his own style and his own approach. But just definitely a heavy manga and anime influence on that.
Right. Now, Benjamin is not only the artist of this webcomic, but also the one who created it. And he, along with Kevin Griveau, writes it.
Right.
Yeah.
But Ryan seems to be I get the impression, and I don't know exactly how they split the work out, but I get the impression that Ryan is the one who's directing the overall story. And he kind of went to, the impression I get is that Ryan has this overall story. He's the artist, and he went back to Kevin and said, hey, this is what I want to do. Can you help me refine it? Can you help me, make sure the dialogue's tight and that kind of thing. So I kind of, and I don't know exactly how they're breaking down the work. But I kind of envision it almost going in kind of like the old school Marvel method, with the exception that Kevin's input doesn't really even start until Ryan has already gotten some of the story ideas down in the first place. Yeah. Whereas, Stan Lee might throw out some pitch ideas to Kirby or Ditko or whomever. I get the impression that Ryan is directing this a little bit more, though, more so in the overall story direction. And Kevin's the one who's saying, okay, hey, wait, we need a scene here that does this, or we need some dialogue here that says that. And he's kind of acting almost more as a writer-editor kind of role than a creator role. A creator is probably the bad word there, but.
Right. Well, okay. So I'm going to ask you about your experience reading Brothers Bond. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is, as with, I think, every webtoon, at least every webtoon, webcomic that I've read, it reads, vertically, right? So a particular chapter, you scroll down in order to read that particular episode or chapter or installment. And sometimes that scroll down can be quite long. Mm-hmm. And then you go to the next page and again, another scroll down in terms of reading that chapter. And so, of course, that's the way that this is set up here. I guess the nature of webtoons, webcomics. This one, though, is a very different kind of webcomic because it's not just static images, as we get with most webcomics on webtoons and otherwise. There's something more multimedia going on. Okay. Yeah. So I think every chapter has a soundtrack of some sort, whether it be music or sound effects or what have you. So there's that. Also, as you scroll through or scroll down in this case, each chapter, there is an animated feel to what's going on. And sometimes the movement of images as you scroll are subtle. Sometimes they're much more abrupt and even violent, given the context, right? Mm-hmm. Given what's going on in the story. And so I'm wondering, what was your experience in reading this comic, in scrolling down and hearing the music, the soundtrack, and seeing the semi-animation?
You know what? Overall, I liked the idea on that. I get the impression that, Ryan also did a lot of the work for that and adding the sounds and sound effects and music and all that, as well as the animations. And he seems to have, in my mind, a good balance of putting enough of that in to give the viewer a little bit deeper experience than if it were just static images, but not going so far to prevent it from being a webcomic any longer, from being a comic any longer, right? So we still have like these animations, but they're for the most part fairly small. We'll see fires flicker or water shimmer or a guy jumping over a rock, and you see the figure leap halfway over. But so you get the sense that there's this, you do get a greater sense of the action and the flow. But without taking it to the level, it's not of full on animation. You're not doing an animated comic. You're not doing an animation, right? I think there was a series that DC did a few years back where they tried to take some of their big books and did like animated versions of, Watchmen and Dark Knight and some of the other kind of classics. And they basically ended up looking like those old 1960s Marvel cartoons where, they'd kind of jiggled the camera a little bit and they'd move something across the screen. And there was no separation of panels. There was no sense of timing from one to the next. Everything just kind of flowed in a more cinematic fashion. And so those things to me got away from being comics and were just animations. And this, I think with Brothers Bond, I don't think we get to that point. And I think the animations he provides are limited enough that we don't get beyond the realm of comics.
Yeah, it reminded me a lot of the webcomic that we looked at back in November of 2016, Hobo Lobo of Hamlin.
Yeah, sure.
And the difference between that one and Brothers Bond is, whereas the Brothers Bond, you scroll down, with Hobo Lobo of Hamlin, and its animation, it was the result of scrolling horizontally through each chapter.
Yeah.
I think that you enjoyed Brothers Bond more than I did. And I'm wondering if that may be the result of how you read it. Did you read it on either a desktop or a laptop or on a tablet device?
I read the
phone.
I read the whole thing on a desktop.
Okay. I think that may make a difference, and I'll tell you why. I read this originally on my iPad. And so that being the case, the strip, the vertical strip basically is as wide as the screen of my iPad. Okay.
Right.
And which is, on the one hand, is good. However, reading it on a tablet, I felt a little claustrophobic, and not only in terms of the animation, but also with the images. I think that something that Benjamin does in his illustration, he gives us a lot of close-ups, a lot. And on a tablet, I had a feeling that I was too close to things. I even moved my tablet away from my eyes. But I still had that claustrophobic feeling. And that was exacerbated by the animation or the semi-animation that went on as I scrolled down, which at times seemed just a little too close to me. And so I felt disturbed reading it. And to compound things, I don't know, I was irritated at the soundtrack. And every time on my tablet, not on my desktop, but on my tablet, whenever I went to a new chapter or a new episode, I had to make sure that the sound was turned off. And there were a couple of cases where I didn't turn off the sound at the top of the chapter. And so I started scrolling through, and all of a sudden music would start up, and it scared the crap out of me. I didn't appreciate that. Now, looking at it on a desktop, and I'm doing that right now, I don't have near the same response, that claustrophobic feeling, as I did when I read it on the tablet, because it doesn't take up near as much of the screen. Also, on my desktop, when I go to each episode, music doesn't automatically start up. And so I think that made a big difference in how I read, at least first time around, Brothers Bond compared to how you read it.
Yeah, and that's I think one of the challenges of webcomics generally, but webtoons specifically, because you've got, that's always been the challenge, in that you've got any number of people looking at your comic on any number of different devices. And so how do you create an experience that works well on all of those? And I think that's something that there's some sacrifices that you have to make as a creator when you're working on that. And you have to say, okay, I'm going to do this for this type of device or that type of device, or I'm not going to make this consideration or I'm going to make that consideration. And that's going to change not only that's going to change some reader's experience at some level. And that depends on what they're reading it on. Yeah. Now I'm curious.
Along with that, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to ask. I was curious too. Have you looked at any of these on your phone as well?
I didn't look at it on my phone. I didn't try that, but I did try it on both my laptop and then the desktop, and I'm in front of my desktop now. But it's the experience with the tablet, I think, that bugged me. Another thing, and maybe this is the more cynical side of me when it comes to webcomics coming out, I'm not really much of a fan of bells and whistles. In other words, if static images can tell the story effectively without any kind of animation, without any kind of other media like music or any kind of sound effects or a soundtrack, then fine. Again, the cynical side of me wonders, what does the animation, what does the music and sound effects bring you that you wouldn't have already? Now, it does help to create, I think, to some degree, an atmosphere. But then I would ask, do I need that atmosphere to enjoy this webcomic? And especially given the fact that some of its elements, its multimedia elements, sometimes the animation, definitely the sound, tended to bug me to where I had to make accommodations as I read this in order to appreciate it. Now, And again, the more cynical side of me wonders if the bells and whistles may be one of the main reasons why the judges chose Brothers Bond as one of the nominees for this year's Best Webcomic. I don't know.
Yeah, honestly, I did, that crossed my mind as well. And if that's the case, I don't know that this was the one thing that I did not like, or I don't want to say I didn't like, but the one thing that I think I could have been done better with the animations and music and that kind of thing, with this comic in particular, is I don't think it was necessarily consistent enough. And what I mean by that is that when you go through some chapters, there would be maybe one or two animations of, just one little simple, one image kind of sliding from one side to another or something. But then there were other chapters that had a slew of animations going on as characters were moving in and out, and, a big fight scene maybe, and you see people shifting back and forth and perspectives change and that kind of thing. And that I found a little bit more distracting in that, there was that inconsistency from one chapter to the next in the amount and level of animation that went into any given chapter. And I can understand to some degree that, you've got, time constraints as you're trying to put something together. And, that's, kind of to your point earlier, the story should be told at least in a static fashion, if nothing else first. And I think that seems to be the case here. I think they were very clear on that was first make sure the story's there, and then we'll add the bells and whistles. But the fact that those bells and whistles kind of came and went to varying degrees, seemed that I found just a little, I don't know, problematic is necessarily the right word, but I found it enough of a distraction that I caught my attention. How exactly the music was used on any given chapter, how exactly the sound effects were used on any given chapter versus how they were used in the previous chapters or the subsequent chapters, or, that kind of thing.
Now, I know I was being cynical and critical earlier when I made, the comments about the multimedia, the bells and whistles. Now, in the event that Kevin Griveau and Ryan Benjamin are listening to this, well, welcome to the Comics Alternative. We're glad that you're giving this a listen. I don't want you guys to think that I don't like this webcomic. I will say, though, that I may not be your ideal audience because I just have a tendency to shy away from multimedia narratives like that. I mean, I have nothing against multimedia narrative, but in terms of, let's say, webcomics, it's a rarity that I'm really taken by animation and even sound added to a webcomic. Again, I come back to the question, what does it bring you? What does it give you that you wouldn't have had already? And at the same time, what does it detract from, right? So I'm not the ideal audience, but I think that there definitely is an audience for this kind of webcomic that does have sound, that does have some animation of some sort. It's just that I'm not the ideal reader for this. So I like it. I am really interested in where the story goes. And I'm not even big into samurai narratives, right? But I'm curious about what's going to be going on with Brothers Bond. So I think it is a compelling story. It's just those bells and whistles that has me a little reserved.
And I think I'm not a big advocate for them necessarily, but like I was saying is, because it seemed like they were paying attention to the story first, I think this would read just as well, or at least minimally as well as a normal story, if there were no animations, if there were no music or sound or anything like that. I think it would still read well. I think it's still a good, solid story. And
really good art.
And really good art. Yeah, he's an excellent artist. So I give him a lot of credit for that. And as long as they maintain that the bells and whistles are only bells and whistles, and they don't take that priority, of being, oh, hey, let's see how flashy we can make this. I think this will continue to be a good story to follow. Mm-hmm.
Well, Sean, we looked at all 5 of the nominees for this year's Best Webcomic category with the Eisner Awards, and they are all webcomics, so that's good. We looked at the 5, including Awaiting a Wave by Dale Carpenter and Nate Powell, Brothers Bond by Kevin Graveau and Ryan Benjamin, Dispatch from a Sanctuary City, Mike Dawson, The Tea-Dragon Society by Katie O'Neill, and then Welcome to the New World by Jake Halpern and Michael Sloan.
And all Eisner-worthy webcomics, I gotta say, in the first place. Whoever ends up winning, congratulations in advance. I don't know if it's definitely they're all worthy and good stories, I think. I would hate to be a judge this year to try and go through them, frankly, but like a lot of the comics that we review on here, they're all very enjoyable in their own right.
Right. Now, in going through this list, I'm reminded of a question that I didn't ask when we were discussing Welcome to the New World. And this originally appeared in the New York Times Sunday Review. Now, it appeared online, but I'm assuming, because I don't get the New York Times, there is a print Sunday Review?
I would presume that. I don't know for sure, though.
And if that's the case, and this was appearing in print at the same time as it was appearing online, then would this be considered a webcomic?
Here's my argument for that.
Okay.
Typically when you would put a comic online from a newspaper of any kind, you're talking Garfield, Dilbert, any of those, right?
Right.
That goes online at midnight of whatever day that we're talking about. But the physical presses that print these that run won't be running until probably 2 or 3 in the morning. So technically it ends up being online at least a couple of hours before in print.
Okay.
So I would argue just about everything you see in the newspaper is a webcomic first anymore, even though it's not intended as such. You can still read Garfield online before you can read it on a physical paper.
See, there is where I would disagree with you, because I would argue that it's the intention that goes there, right? So the intention for about all the comics that come out in the newspaper that are nonetheless available online, they were created for originally a print publication, but these print publications out of necessity have to have an online component.
Right.
So
that's,
but I didn't ask this question. We were discussing Welcome to the New World, though.
I think it's a fair argument in either direction, though, honestly.
Yeah.
But I don't know if the New York Times necessarily has that Sunday print version that this would have showed up in necessarily first or not.
Yeah.
But
I don't know.
It looks like it was designed. It looks like this one was designed for a web presence, I think, more so than like a Garfield or a Dilbert or something like that.
Well, yes and no. If you read it from the New York Times website, and I'm not even talking about the firewall issue, it's not easy to read because each chapter or each installment is its own quote unquote article. And so basically you read one and you can't just click to the next one. You have to click back and then go to the next installment, so on and so forth. So it doesn't function as a webcomic in that way.
It doesn't function well. That's just bad.
Yeah,
that's just bad navigation on the New York Times website is all that is.
Right. And it's not as if the New York Times is really into webcomics.
Exactly.
But as you pointed out, 5 very interesting webcomics, 5 interesting nominees, and good luck.
Good luck to everybody.
To all 5.
Yes.
That's right. And if you want to find great comics narratives like the ones that we were discussing on this episode, then definitely head over to the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. And remember, if you like your comics in digital form, you can shop at their sister company, mydigitalcomics.com. So that's whether it's dcbservice.com or mydigitalcomics.com. You can't go wrong with those guys. And after you do get your titles there, get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about this month's webcomics episode. And also, wish Sean well in his recovery.
Thank you.
If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up your phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And if there's any comics that you want to get us you want to get us in front of to take a look at, it might be easier to send us an email. That way you can just provide a quick link rather than trying to bubble your way through explaining it through over the phone line there. You can email us at twoguys, TWOGUIS, at comicsalternative.com. Or you can email me directly at Sean, SEAN, at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. You can also contact us via social media, such as on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com.
Tons of ways to get a hold of us. We try to be as open as possible, so please get in touch.
Yeah, we like to hear from you, and we will be back next month. I mean, barring any unforeseen accidents.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes. So, hey, we'll be back in June. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Sean, and we'll see you then.